Everybody can play retro games now, whether it's on your phone, your PC, or even those little standalone retro handhelds. And because of that, the barrier to entry has just been completely obliterated. So in this video, I'm going to be recommending some really weird, interesting games that I think are worth checking out. Even if some aren't necessarily the best games in the world, I think these are pretty interesting. And yeah, I know there's a lot of videos on this platform that say they're going to recommend a ton of different underrated gems, only to go on to suggest stuff like Earthbound. But my goal here is to actually deliver on it and show you some stuff that you probably haven't heard of, or at least you just dismissed because you didn't think that they had anything interesting going on when they actually do. But regardless, there's going to be a real mix of games here, so if one doesn't necessarily appeal to you specifically, stick around because the next one might. But yeah, you can basically play these games on anything at this point, so get familiar with your favorite search engine, and I'm going to guide you through some games that I think deserve a bigger spotlight on them, for one reason or another. Dark Arms on the Neo Geo Pocket Color is a really cool top-down adventure, RPG, action, shooter kind of thing, survival horror. It's a strange mix of different ideas, and that's a really cool thing to see on a console like the Neo Geo Pocket Color. You're going to be exploring this overworld while also blasting away all of these different gothic monsters. And while you do that, you're going to be collecting spirits and upgrading your weapons to progress through the game. So if you want to play a top-down Zelda-style game that has a good mix of Resident Evil in there, from a console that doesn't get a lot of love, don't forget about the Neo Geo Pocket Color and Dark Arms.
It's behind us. Shield recovered. More to the left.
Moving on to Bulk Slash, which is a game with an incredible effort out of the fan translation community, because there is a lot of work that went into this one. It's a Sega Saturn third-person mech game that is really impressive with so much character that went into this one. But boiled down, the gameplay here is a lot like Virtual On, or like my foothold in the genre, the Ghost in the Shell game on the PS1. But in this one, you're going to be transforming your mech into these different forms to take on different challenges. There's been a ton of awesome work done by an awesome community on making this game playable in English, including voice acting, and it's just really above and beyond.
Energy shots. Shield recovered.
Chaos Break is a PlayStation 1 game in the style of Resident Evil, but it takes pretty much a carbon copy of Resident Evil and then ups it into a little bit more of absurdity and a lot more action. You'll be playing as two different agents, one of them looking a lot like Jill Valentine, but you're going to be doing a lot more blasting here. And not unlike the later sections of the early Resident Evil games, you're going to be investigating this lab that's been overrun by mutant lab staff, so it's going to be pretty familiar to any Resident Evil fan out there. So if you're a fan of classic Resident Evil, sure, this isn't going to stack up to it really, but it's going to definitely have a lot of interesting different things in it that will definitely recall your nostalgia for those older games.
I know.
Whoa! What? Who are you?
Oh, Peter, don't you remember me? I'm Tink. Come on, let's go, hurry.
Hook for the Sega CD is a game that I can't really accurately represent in this video for copyright reasons, but the Sega CD version of Hook is super interesting because it actually uses the John Williams score from the movie. But if you've watched the movie Hook, you know what this is about. It's an older Peter Pan who's forced to go back to Neverland and save a bunch of kids, and he kind of forgot how that all worked. Though in the game here, he pretty quickly gets back into the role of Peter Pan and flying and jumping around, so most of that character development is just implied. In terms of gameplay, this is going to be a super straightforward platformer that has a little bit of combat in it. So if you want to play a game that is super nostalgic to even, you know, the Robin Williams movie, but also retains the amazing classic score from John Williams, you should totally check this one out. It's a really neat little oddity. Next up is Scurge Hive, which is a GBA and Nintendo DS game that gives a lot of love to the Metroid franchise, but it does a few things in its own way to make it stand out. As you might expect, it's going to be a search action, find an object, unlock another door that you couldn't get through before sort of game, but unlike a lot of games in this genre, it's going to be done from an isometric perspective. So check that one out if you're looking for a Metroidvania that really does pay a lot of love and homage to specifically the Metroid series, while also doing things its own way. Undercover Cops is a Super Famicom and arcade beat-em-up, but really, just look at this game. The sprite art here is incredibly detailed for a Super Nintendo game. But yeah, besides that, this is going to be a pretty straightforward beat-em-up game, you know, belt-scroller action game. A lot of people have a lot of issues with genre names and stuff, you know. It's Souls-likes or Metroidvanias, beat-em-ups even at this point, but you get what I mean here. This is going to be a lot like Final Fight, where you fight through a ton of different thugs to a boss on a side-scrolling sort of foreground-background movement Streets of Rage style thing. But as I said, the thing that makes this game really stand out amongst all of the tons of other beat-em-up games, which I'm going to be covering a lot more in this video, just to let you know, is it's just incredibly detailed sprite art, and it's really grimy, futuristic New York City setting, and I think that this is a really easy one to pick up and play through in like an hour on like a retro handheld, just a short time, quick session, get through it and put it down sort of game. PuLiRuLa is an arcade, Sega Saturn, and early PlayStation game that is a beat-em-up, but this one definitely has a lot of its own character to it. It's almost like what Parodius is to the shoot-em-up genre, PuLiRuLa is like that to the beat-em-up genre. It has this bizarre, cartoonish, almost Babes in Toyland anime art style to it, and that sort of approach to a game like this is pretty unique. So if you're a fan of beat-em-ups like myself, but want to play something with a lot of unique character to it, there's that one to check out. Dr. Slump on the PlayStation 1 is an adaptation of the manga from Toriyama that predated Dragon Ball. In this game, you're going to be exploring and doing a lot of different mini-games and talking to a village full of charming characters. It's sort of like a loose take on Ocarina of Time, but done with less of a combat focus and more of a childlike sense of whimsy to it. So if you're a fan of the Dr. Slump series, or just like the village sections in a lot of RPGs, or even like Hyrule Castletown, give this translation done by Hilltop Works a good look. Avenging Spirit is a Game Boy game that has a really awesome core hook to it, and that is that you play as a little ghost and you can possess enemies and use their abilities to take out all the other enemies. Your goal here as the ghost is to get revenge and save your kidnapped girlfriend. So if you're looking for a typical straightforward action platformer, but you also want to have a fun little twist, make sure you give that one a look. Shadow Force is an arcade beat-em-up, but just like the last game, this game also has a possession mechanic where you can play as the enemies, and I always think that that's a fun little gimmick. This one got caught up in the ninja craze of the 90s, and it really shows. So if you're a fan of this genre, I think that this is another beat-em-up that's worth adding to your list. Rampage Puzzle Attack is a GBA game that I was not expecting to get addicted to on my Anbernic handheld, but when you boot this game up, it just has fundamental fun gameplay to it. What this game really is a port of Drop Mania, but with a Rampage themed coat of paint on it. And I just really find that gameplay pretty fun. It plays similarly to something like Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, but instead of being able to rotate your pieces all the way around, you just can kind of swap them horizontally. So you're going to be connecting these big sections of colored blocks together and then dropping like a detonation cube on top of them to get rid of all of that color on the screen. It's pretty much as simple as it can get. And for a game that you're just going to sit out and veg with, especially if you have a retro handheld, this is a really good one just to get absorbed into if you're looking to unwind. Marvelous Another Treasure Island is a SNES pretty well-known game at this point. I know I'm kind of stretching hidden gems with this one, but it's a game that really takes a lot from The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past and makes it into less of an action-y game and more of just a pure puzzle adventure logic game. The most notable fact about this one is something that you've probably already heard already, but it was directed by Eiji Aonuma, who went on to basically become the godfather of the Zelda series. In this one, you're going to be switching between 3 different kids that have their own abilities to explore this island and see what hidden treasure they can find. So if you're a Zelda fan and the combat just kind of gets in the way, this one's great if you're just looking for a straightforward puzzle-solving little adventure.
Sword. Grenade. Sword.
The Outfoxies is an arcade game that I think should get a lot more credit for basically creating the platform fighting genre. And I think that it doesn't because a lot of people in the West haven't played it because this was a Japan-only arcade game. The gameplay here is, a lot like Smash Brothers. You're going to be fighting on these large arenas and using weapons and stage hazards to win. But in this case, it does a lot more of the weapons and stage hazard stuff and a lot less of the melee combat, though it still is here in some ways. The plot to this one is that you play as a bunch of different assassins that fight for this mysterious Mr. Acme. So if you and a buddy want to play a game that's pretty much the granddaddy of Super Smash Brothers, make sure you don't let that one slip you by. The Nightmare Before Christmas, The Pumpkin King is a licensed game on the Game Boy Advance, and this isn't going to be the only one in this video, but I think around this time a lot of people just assumed a lot of the licensed games on the Game Boy Advance were just shovelware trash, but there was a lot of interesting stuff that was happening on that platform at the time that I just think got brushed under the rug a little bit too quick. In this case, it's a prequel to The Nightmare Before Christmas, and you play as Jack Skellington, but it's a Metroidvania, and I think that alone makes this a pretty neat oddity and worth at least booting up and checking out a little bit. Sure, it's not going to stack up to like Aria of Sorrow, but it is a Nightmare Before Christmas Metroidvania game. How odd is that? So make sure you give that one a look if you're a frequent visitor to Hot Topic. Cliffhanger Edgar Randy is an arcade action game where you're basically Indiana Jones. You're going to be using your whip to attack and swing through levels and defeat enemies. It has this really cinematic presentation to it that sells the Indiana Jones thing. So if you're a big fan of indie and want to see some arcade hardware pushed to its limits, this is a really neat little adventure. Ihatovo Monogatari is a really neat little proto-cozy type game. It's inspired by the stories of Kenji Miyazawa, and it's just a nice little peaceful adventure. You're going to be exploring, collecting items, and talking to tons of different characters, and it has just nice laid-back vibes. So if you're looking for a calm slice of life, make sure you give that one a look. Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith on the GBA is a game that, I know, probably really stretching the underrated tag here on this one, but it was doing something that a lot of games of its era weren't doing anymore, and that was being a licensed game that is a beat 'em up. And what I mean by that is that like a decade before this is when the beat 'em up genre kind of fizzled out, especially for licensed games, and only recently it's kind of been reinvigorated with stuff like Shredder's Revenge and even those like Power Rangers one that just came out, and there's a G.I. Joe one, so it's become a new revival of sorts lately. But this one came out right in the dark era, where it was less common to see an adaptation like this. Really, if I'm comparing this to any beat 'em ups, it's more similar to something like River City Ransom or the Scott Pilgrim game, because it's going to have a lot more length to it than a lot of other beat 'em ups, and it has a whole upgrade system to it. And I also just really like its art style. It has a lot of really great kind of almost chibi takes on Star Wars characters, and that just makes the aesthetic really charming. So if you're a Star Wars fan and you only are familiar with really the PlayStation 2 3D action game that came out around Revenge of the Sith, make sure you at least boot that one up. Kuusou Kagaku Seku Gulliver Boy is a Super Nintendo action-adventure game that might be a big hit for fans of games like Secret of Mana. And like that game, you're going to be exploring, talking to NPCs, and fighting enemies. But I think the thing that makes this one really stand out is its amazing pixel art and character portraits. I mean, look at this. It's like Yu-Gi-Oh! It looks incredible on the SNES. So if you're looking for a new action RPG, make sure you give that one a look. Robo Army on the Neo Geo is just another super solid beat 'em up. And in this one, you're going to be playing as a cyborg who has this transformation mechanic, and you're going up against this professor's titular Robo Army. So chuck that one on the pile of other solid beat 'em ups that you can probably beat in one sitting. King of Demons is a super strange, kind of jank take on Castlevania, but in this one you're going to be blasting away to rescue your family from hell. Another common mechanic that keeps coming up in this video is transformation, and in this one you can transform into different demons to take out the opposition. So if you're looking for a classic Castlevania style game, but you want it to be not quite as good and a lot more weird, you've got to give that one a chance. If that last game wasn't enough Castlevania for you, here I have Hunter x Hunter Kindan no Hihou on the Game Boy Color, which is a Castlevania-style game, and it was even made by Konami. So it's going to deliver on the Castlevania that you expect, but this just happens to have the Hunter x Hunter license to it. And as somebody who's not really familiar with Hunter x Hunter, this one is just a really neat game for Castlevania fans too. So if you want to play an action platform game with some light RPG progression to it, and are maybe even a fan of Hunter x Hunter, make sure you give that one a look. Battle Circuit is yet another beat 'em up game because, you know, I like the genre, this is my video after all, but Battle Circuit is one from Capcom, and I really love this one a lot. And this is one that is probably a little bit more well known, especially because it was released as part of the Capcom beat 'em up bundle, but I still think this one doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. What it basically does is takes Capcom's other major beat 'em up franchise, that being Final Fight, and ups the ante into the absurdity of new level, or maybe even like takes Captain Commando and mixes it in there, and it just makes it a totally bombastic, over-the-top, awesome beat 'em up with a ton of character to it. The plot to this one is that you play as a bunch of different bounty hunters who are capturing criminals all over the galaxy, and you also take down a dangerous computer program. So if you're a big fan of Capcom's beat 'em up output around this time, you definitely have to give this one a shot. I think this one is one of their best. TMNT Radical Rescue on the Game Boy is a game that really was punching above its weight for a licensed game at its time, because this one is basically a Metroidvania game where you go around and save the different turtles who all have their unique abilities that you can use to take out different obstacles around the map. You can even check this one out as part of the new Turtles collection that's out, and I really think that this is honestly one of the best games in there besides like Turtles in Time. So if the idea of a Ninja Turtles Metroidvania game really sparks some interest in you, give this one a good look. Moving on to yet another beat 'em up, it's not gonna stop. I'm a big fan of the genre, and I think that a lot of these just got swept under the rug because they weren't X-Men or Ninja Turtles, you know? But this one is also from Konami, just like those games, and I think this one stands up to those and is a great game in its own right. The hook to this one is that it's another transformation kind of game, yet another recurring theme here. And what it does is it pretty much delivers on Altered Beast, and does it way better than Altered Beast ever really did. Melfand Story is a Super Nintendo action side-scrolling game that I think has a lot of character to it. You're going to be hacking and slashing and collecting items and choosing different paths to take on a map. You have 4 different heroes to usurp the king and take out the different allies, and what you're going to be doing is basically going through their own little unique stories. This is one I think is more of an oddity than a great game, but I think this one's definitely worth booting up if you see it in your ROM collection. Dungeon Magic is another beat-em-up from the arcade, but this one happens to take place from a more isometric perspective. You'll be fighting, collecting items, and basically playing a D&D game that's not officially D&D. Each character has their own stats that makes each of them feel pretty different, and there are branching paths, so there's a lot of different ways that things can go. So check that one out if you've already played through the official Capcom D&D games, and you want a slightly different take. The Shaman King Master of Spirits games are kind of like a spiritual successor-ish of that Hunter x Hunter game that I talked about a little bit earlier. What they're basically going to deliver is another Castlevania-style experience, but this time it's going to be more in the vein of Aria of Sorrow, because you're going to be taking different enemies' spirits and using them in a similar way that you do in that game. Shaman King is another manga and anime franchise that I'm not really familiar with, but this one just delivers a super cool game that might satisfy an itch if you're a big fan of Aria of Sorrow. But obviously this doesn't deliver as great of an experience as that game, but, you know, it scratches the itch a little bit. Moving on to the final beat-em-up in this video, I promise you, is Gaia Crusaders, and it is just another solid one of these. This one being set in a post-apocalyptic setting, and you have a bunch of different characters with a bunch of different abilities, and there's a whole magic system, and, you know, it does the beat-em-up stuff, and it does it pretty well. So that one's another one for the pile. Far East from Eden Zero is a Super Famicom Japanese exclusive game that had a ton of love and work put into it, kind of like Bulk Slash, where it took a lot of work from a fan community to really make this one work in English, because there's just so much text in this one. And that goes a long way to flesh out this world and really make each of the NPCs into their own characters. Another reason why this game probably wasn't localized officially at the time of its release is because it used a lot of hardware on the actual cartridge that a lot of other games didn't. This game made use of like a real-time clock and a ton of different tech that really wasn't present in a lot of Super Nintendo games. So if you're a fan of turn-based RPGs, especially games like Dragon Quest, I think you definitely need to give this one a look. There's just so much love and passion and work that went into this one from a community of people who just wanted to make this finally available in English, and it really paid off. Then we have the final game in this video, and it is Car Battler Joe. It is a really unique game on the Game Boy Advance. And that's because it's like a vehicular combat RPG. So what you're going to be doing is fighting other enemies in these car-based battles, earning money to upgrade your car even more to take on even more challenging enemies. It really stands out amongst the other games in the GBA library. Alright, thank you guys so much for watching my second video on non-obvious retro games to check out. Most of the games that I talked about in this video were suggested in the comments of my last video like this, and if you want me to do another one, suggest some more games, because my well has been pretty well dried out. But yeah, if you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like the last one I did like this, but you'd probably like a lot of the other stuff that I have on my channel. I have a few series. I have one that's about like fan games, and I know that that would probably have a lot of crossover with this one. And if you also like more hidden gems of the more modern variety, I also have a series where I talk about stuff that's hidden on Steam. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you did all the YouTube-y stuff, you know, subscribe, share, like, do all that stuff. If you share this video around, put it on some Discords, that really makes a huge difference for me, and I really appreciate it so much. Thank you for watching.